They were meant to capture moments of farewell, fragments of grief frozen in the stillness of early photography. 3 funerals, 3 different towns, 3 different years, and yet one boy. Each photograph, taken between 1860 and 1887, tells the same story of mourning. Black veils, lace gloves, pale faces gathered in the dim light of a shuttered parlor. The camera's gaze lingers over faces heavy with loss, but if you look closely, always at the edge of the frame, stands a small boy. Barely 10 years old, pale, expressionless, hands clasped before him, his eyes fixed directly on the lens. In the first image, taken in a quiet home in Sussex, the boy stands beside the coffin of a young girl. In the second, captured 17 years later in Manchester, he is there again, unchanged. Same height, same face, same hollow stare. The third, from 1887 in Bristol, seals the impossible pattern. Time has passed, but the child has not aged a day. No record names him. No family claims him. He does not appear in parish records, census reports, or death registries. To the camera, he exists. To history, he doesn't. It wasn't until 1972 that a retired photo historian named Harold Greaves noticed the connection. While restoring a collection of Victorian post-mortem photographs, he realized 3 of them carried the same spectral figure, identical down to the smallest detail. Greaves called it the boy who appeared in 3 funerals but was never buried. For decades, skeptics have argued coincidence, a reused plate, a studio prop, a trick of exposure. But others believe the lens captured something not meant to be seen, and so the question lingers, more than a century later. If the dead are remembered through photographs, then who remembers the ones who were never alive? Between 1880 and 1905, death was not hidden away, and it was framed, dressed, and immortalized. Victorian England stood at the height of its post-mortem photography era, a time when mourning was both ritual and art. Families who could afford it summoned photographers to capture the final image of a loved one, the only image, in many cases, they would ever possess. The dead were arranged in lifelike poses, children seated with toys, mothers propped in chairs, men resting with books half open in their hands. The illusion was not morbid to them, it was devotion. Photograph became proof that love could outlast decay. The process was painstaking. Exposure times were long, the air heavy with the scent of varnish and roses meant to mask the truth of death. Curtains were drawn, candles lit, and silence pressed close around the living and the dead alike. To a Victorian mind, the photograph was not a record of death. It was a bridge to memory, and perhaps to something beyond. Nearly a century later, in 1972, Professor Edith Hargreaves of King's College, London, was restoring a private collection of late 19th century funeral photographs for a museum exhibit. Hargreaves was no stranger to the oddities of early photography. Glass negatives double exposed, chemical burns on the paper, accidental blurs mistaken for ghosts. But among 3 separate estates, one in Sussex, another in Manchester, and a third in Bristol, she found something that defied even her experienced eye. 3 funerals. 3 photographs, 3 different photographers, and one boy. He stood in each image unchanged. The same pale features, same vacant gaze, same small stature, always positioned near the coffin. His likeness was identical, not just in face, but in posture and dress. Hargreaves initially dismissed it as coincidence, perhaps a studio model or a reused glass plate. But the names on the backs of each print told otherwise. Each belonged to a different household, different year, and different region entirely. She began verifying the origins. Each photograph was authenticated as an original. No forgeries, no darkroom tricks. The photographic plates were unique, unconnected, and impossible to replicate without access to time itself. Her disbelief deepened into quiet dread. If the boy wasn't a product of manipulation, then something else had been captured, and so the mystery took its first breath in modern history, a puzzle suspended between science and superstition. Because if the cameras didn't lie, then history itself did. The first image was taken in the spring of 1882 in the quiet Yorkshire village of Whitchurch Hollow, a place so small it barely appeared on Victorian maps. It was commissioned by the Davenport family, following the death of their 12-year-old daughter, Clara. Like many families of their class and time, the Davenports wished for a post-mortem portrait, a final moment to preserve her youth before time erased her completely. The photograph itself, preserved on a glass plate negative, appeared typical at first glance. Clara lay upon a narrow oak coffin, her hands folded over a lace shawl, her head tilted to one side as though peacefully asleep. Behind her, the family stood in solemn formation, father, mother, two brothers, faces drained of life as though grief had already taken root. The parlor was curtained, dim and perfumed with lilies, and yet, when Professor Edith Hargreaves first examined the image in 1972, her attention fixed not on the girl but on the figure standing to her left. A boy, no older than 8. He stood perfectly still, small hands clasped before him, head slightly inclined, the classic posture of mourning. But something was wrong. He wasn't part of the family line. His placement was central, directly in front of the coffin, where no stranger would ever be allowed to stand. The Davenports' descendants, when contacted decades later, could identify every relative in the photo, except him. No one had ever seen the child before. Hargreaves enlarged the image, tracing the faint detail of the boy's clothes. An old wool coat, collar frayed, buttons mismatched. His expression was unnerving, not sadness, not fear, but calm, almost expectant. His pale eyes caught the light in a way that made them appear almost reflective, as though something was shining from behind them rather than upon them. She cross-referenced every surviving parish record from Whitchurch Hollow between 1880 and 1883. Births, baptisms, census lists, none described a child of that age or appearance. The village was small. Every name was accounted for. He did not exist in any archive, any ledger, any local memory. The photographer Thomas Bellamy was a regional portraitist known for his precision and technical skill. His notes, recovered from a small ledger found among his estate papers, mentioned the Davenport Commission briefly. One line only, April 7th. Child, exposure longer than usual. Light behaved strangely. 2 weeks later, Bellamy fell ill. Pneumonia, according to the death register. But in the weeks before he died, he told his apprentice that something had gone wrong with the image. His last entry in the ledger read simply, "Something wrong with the exposure." The boy was too clear. When Bellamy's belongings were later sorted by his widow, his camera, a brass and mahogany Thornton Pickard field model, was stored away in the attic of their Yorkshire home, forgotten for nearly a century. In 1973, Hargreaves tracked it down through Bellamy's surviving relatives. Dust-coated and warped by damp, it was still intact. Inside, she found 2 glass negatives, one matching the Davenport family's funeral portrait, the second unmarked and never developed. When processed under modern lab conditions, the image that appeared froze her breath. It showed only the boy, no family, no coffin, no parlor, only that same child standing in the center of a blank, ghost-pale backdrop, eyes fixed directly toward the camera. The edges of the photograph bled into blackness, as though the rest of the room had never existed. And there, etched in silver nitrate across a century, was the same unsettling calm, the kind that lingers in the silence between the living and the dead. For months after discovering the undeveloped plate, Professor Edith Hargreaves kept the boy's image locked away in her office drawer at the University of Leeds. She had spent years studying early photography, ghost exposures, double plates, the accidental illusions of the Victorian era. But this one, it was different. There was no visible trace of overexposure, no light leak, no layering. The boy was perfectly clear, sharper even than the family around him in the first photograph. In 1974, she brought the negatives to Dr. Lionel Merton, a photographic analyst who had worked with the Royal Society archives. He examined both plates, the Davenport family portrait and the solitary image of the boy, under ultraviolet and infrared light. His findings unsettled everyone in the room. "The emulsion patterns match perfectly," he said. "Same plate batch, same chemical structure. But here's the impossible part. The density curve on the boy's face is identical in both images. Not similar, identical. Down to the micron, that meant one thing. The same image of the boy had been captured twice at 2 separate times, on 2 different plates, without duplication. Hargreaves asked whether it could be a transfer error, an imprint left by prolonged pressure between plates. Merton shook his head. If that were the case, The ghost image would appear faint, reversed, and grain-distorted. This is none of that. This boy was standing there, forward twice and in two separate exposures. The implication was absurd. A single child had appeared twice in the same photographic session, once among the mourners, and once alone, without ever being recorded, noticed, or remembered. Hargreaves decided to trace the chain of ownership for Bellamy's equipment and plates. In doing so, she uncovered something stranger still. Between 1881 and 1882, Bellamy had photographed 3 other funerals across Yorkshire. 2 of those negatives were lost. The third, belonging to the Winslow family of Harrogate, had been sold at auction in 1937 and vanished into a private collection. After nearly a year of correspondence, she located it in the possession of an antiques dealer in Bath. The image, a typical Victorian parlor funeral scene, was cracked, its edges water-damaged, but there, faint and unmistakable, stood the same pale boy. The same coat, the same clasped hands, the same fixed gaze. This photo was dated 1889, 7 years after the first. Hargreaves began to suspect that Bellamy himself had seen the boy, perhaps more than once. She revisited his surviving correspondence and found a letter written to his brother days before his death. The child was not on the list, not in the room when I began. But when I looked through the glass, there he was and watching. That line alone was enough to unnerve her for weeks. It suggested that Bellamy had noticed the boy only through his camera's lens, invisible to the naked eye. To rule out coincidence, Hargreaves consulted several historical societies and local archives. The surname Davenport, she learned, had briefly intersected with the Winslow family through a textile trade partnership. Both families had attended a funeral in Leeds in 1878, that of Arthur Bell, a merchant whose young nephew was rumoured to have died mysteriously the same year, but the records of the nephew's death were incomplete. Parish ledgers listed the burial as child unnamed, presumed relation. The body had never been formally identified. That was when Hargreaves noticed something she had missed before. On the back of the Winslow photograph, faintly penciled, was a name, A. Bell. She began to theorize that the boy might have been Arthur Bell's missing nephew, a child whose burial had been recorded but never confirmed. But the math didn't add up. If the first photo was from 1882 and the second from 1889, the boy should have aged at least 7 years. Yet he hadn't changed at all. Desperate for clarity, she sent the negatives to a forensic photo laboratory in London. The analysts digitally overlaid the 2 portraits. Every facial line, iris reflection, and proportional angle matched exactly. When the transparency was merged, the boy's image aligned with mathematical precision. Not similar, not coincidental, identical. One of the technicians, normally skeptical of paranormal claims, simply muttered, "It's like he was printed from the same shadow." Then came a new discovery that pushed the case into darker territory. In late 1975, while examining Bellamy's camera more thoroughly, Hargreaves found a thin sheet of paper wedged behind the focusing plate. It was a torn piece of stationery from St. Luke's Parish Home for Orphaned Boys, dated March 1882. Written in ink, almost illegible, were 3 words: "Do not photograph him." St. Luke's was located only 6 miles from Whitchurch Hollow, the same village where Bellamy had taken the Davenport photo. Its records, however, had long since been destroyed in a fire in 1911. Hargreaves was left with fragments, a missing orphan, a photographer's warning, and a boy who refused to age across time. That winter, she locked the 3 plates, Davenport, Winslow, and the isolated boy, inside a university archive cabinet. She sealed them with a note for future researchers. If these are forgeries, they are flawless. If they are not, then we have captured something that was never meant to be seen. Yet one thought lingered in her mind, growing darker with every passing day. If Bellamy had only taken 2 plates in 1882, then who took the 3rd photograph where the boy appeared again years later, long after Bellamy's death? By 1976, Professor Edith Hargreaves had exhausted every rational explanation. She had verified the materials, the photographic chemicals, and the exposure methods. She had compared the images under multiple spectrums of light. Each test ended with the same impossible result. The boy had not changed, not a fraction of an inch, not a wrinkle, not a flicker of time. Then, During a lecture at the Royal Photographic Society in London, Hargreaves presented her findings. Her peers listened politely, though most regarded her conclusions as an academic curiosity, rather than evidence of something supernatural. But among the attendees sat Dr. Malcolm Avery, a quiet man in his 60s, who introduced himself afterward as an archivist for the Church of England's Historical Division. He requested a private meeting, claiming he had information that might explain, or at least contextualize, the photographs. Hargreaves agreed. A week later, in Avery's office in Canterbury, he pulled a box from the shelf. Dust plumed into the air as he opened it. Inside were brittle parish records, handwritten letters, and several daguerreotype photographs dating from the 1870s to the early 1900s. He pointed to one record, a burial log from 1878, the same year as Arthur Bell's nephew's supposed death, but this log was unusual. The entry for the child's burial had been crossed out, and beside it someone had written, "Body not recovered and withheld for study." Avery explained that the notation referred to a controversial practice of the time. Certain children's corpses, particularly those from orphanages, were occasionally retained for anatomical or photographic study by early spiritualist societies. They believed the newly dead could act as conduits between worlds and that photography could capture evidence of the soul's departure. In one of the accompanying letters, dated March 3, 1879, a Reverend Silas Ward wrote to a benefactor, "The boy is most peculiar. Even in death the eyes refuse to close. The photographer insists light reflects from them differently, as though the gaze remains aware." The letter was signed with initials, A.B. Arthur Bell. This discovery reframed everything. If Arthur Bell had been connected to both the orphan child and the families later photographed, perhaps the boy was no ordinary orphan. Perhaps he was part of an early, forgotten experiment in spirit photography, the kind that Victorian society had quietly buried beneath religion and superstition. But there was still the problem of time. Even if the boy's image had been first captured in 1878, how could he reappear in clear physical form years later? In 1882 and again in 1889, in unrelated funerals. Avery leaned forward. "Perhaps," he said, "you're looking at this backward. Maybe the boy wasn't following the deaths. Maybe the deaths followed him." That sentence haunted Hargreaves for weeks. She began mapping the dates and locations of each photograph, cross-referencing them with recorded child deaths in Yorkshire and surrounding counties. A grim pattern began to form. In every town where the boy appeared, another child, always between the ages of 8 and 12, had died within days of the photograph being taken. Each time the body was described as unusually pale, expression serene, eyes open. She compiled the data and noticed something chilling. Each death occurred on the same day of the year, March 9th. It wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern stretching over a decade. When Hargreaves returned to Avery with her findings, he simply nodded. "You found what they once called the mirror child phenomenon." He explained that between 1875 and 1900, whispers of a recurring figure, a boy appearing at funerals and in photographic plates, had circulated among rural priests and undertakers. They believed he was a spirit, neither benevolent nor malicious, that appeared only when a soul's passage was incomplete. A mirror, they said, reflecting what was unresolved. No photographs had ever survived, except these 3. Driven by obsession, Hargreaves petitioned for access to the St. Luke's orphanage ruins, where Bellamy's note had warned, "Do not photograph him." The building was long abandoned, its records destroyed, but the cellar remained. Inside, amid the debris and collapsed beams, she found remnants of an old darkroom, rusted trays, cracked glass plates, and one intact copper exposure frame. Scratched into the wood beneath it were faint words. "Gouged by a blade or nail. He stands when the shutter closes." When Hargreaves brought the frame back to Leeds, she noticed something strange. The chemical residue still adhered to the metal. Decades old, yet faintly iridescent under light. For curiosity's sake, she placed it under ultraviolet and exposed a modern photographic plate. The resulting image chilled her to silence. Faintly visible, fragmented by time and corrosion, was the same outline of a boy. Hands clasped, head tilted slightly to the side. There had been a fourth photograph all along, one not taken by Bellamy or anyone else, but imprinted directly into the equipment used to capture others. It became clear to her that whatever this phenomenon was, it wasn't about a person or even a spirit. It was about the act of photographing death itself. Every camera that had captured a funeral in those regions seemed, in some way, to have absorbed the boy's image, as if death had learned to look back. In her private journal, Hargreaves wrote, "The boy was never alive in the way we understand. He was an echo, something created when grief and exposure met in perfect silence." The following month, she published a paper that was quietly removed from circulation days later, allegedly at the request of church officials. Her colleagues dismissed it as a curiosity, a blurred boundary between science and superstition. But one photograph remained on her desk until the day she died. The boy's face, clearer than all the rest, and in its reflection on the glass plate, faintly, like a trick of the light, a second face began to form beside it, a woman's, her own. By the early spring of 1892, Eleanor Hargreaves had grown obsessed with the Bellamy archive. The glass plates she had recovered from the photographer's cellar were now catalogued, dated, and examined under every possible light. Yet there remained something stubbornly alive in them, a residue that refused to fade. She began to search through death registries first. The London County Archives held brittle ledgers, filled with cramped ink and trembling signatures, each line a whisper of the dead. Weeks passed before a name caught her attention. Samuel Kearney, age 10, deceased, 1881. Cause: asphyxiation during photographic experiment. Attending E. Bellamy. The entry was precise, almost bureaucratic, but the phrasing unsettled her. Photographic experiment? There were no known trials in London during that period involving children, and yet the surname Bellamy, inked with a looping flourish, was unmistakable. In the Guild of Photographic Science, Hargreaves found further mention of Bellamy's work. He had corresponded with early spiritualist photographers, men who claimed they could capture the lingering image of the soul through prolonged exposure. Some believed the camera could trap grief itself, holding it in suspension between life and death. They called it retention of essence through exposure. At first, Eleanor dismissed it as superstition dressed in science, but as she studied Bellamy's surviving glass plates, patterns began to form. Certain smudges appeared to move between negatives, the faint outline of a small boy, his posture slumped, the contours of his face dissolving in silver decay. She contacted a chemical analyst at the University of Edinburgh, sending him several samples. The report returned 2 weeks later. Consistent traces of silver bromide breakdown, indicates prolonged double exposure and reuse of photographic plates. The explanation was plausible until she compared the exposure coordinates. Each photograph containing the boy's faint figure had been taken within 5 miles of St. Bartholomew's Cemetery, where Samuel Kearney had been buried. Coincidence, perhaps. But Hargreaves could not dismiss the repetition. Driven by equal parts reason and unease, she traced the records of the orphanage where Kearney had lived before his death. The matron, an elderly woman with a voice like cracked glass, remembered him vaguely. A quiet child, fond of drawing and light. When Eleanor mentioned Bellamy, the woman grew still. "Yes," she said softly. "He came often. Said he wanted to teach the boy to look into the light without fear." That night, Eleanor reread Bellamy's notebooks, recovered from a box beneath his studio floorboards. His handwriting alternated between precise technical notes and desperate confession. Exposure too long. The eyes retained the shimmer. Must attempt again. Samuel's reflection holds. If I can fix it properly, he will remain. The words chilled her. Bellamy had not been trying to photograph death. He had been trying to prevent it. In May of that year, Hargreaves presented her findings at a small symposium on photographic anomalies. She detailed the chain of evidence, the registry entries, the bromide decay, the proximity of each photograph to Kearney's grave. But the response was polite dismissal. One critic called her theory a sentimental overlay upon chemical error. Another laughed that she had been seduced by the romance of ghost stories. Only one man, Dr. Felix Armitage, an expert in early emulsion chemistry, lingered after her talk. He studied her notes in silence, then whispered, "Miss Hargreaves, These are not independent plates. Your data suggests memory in the medium. Contamination, yes, but consistent contamination. The same spectral residue repeating. She frowned. You mean Bellamy reused his glass? Armitage shook his head slowly. He reused his grief. The emulsion has preserved more than light. The bromide has aged like skin, remembering what it once held. That phrase stayed with her. Remembering what it once held. She returned to her lodging that night, with the negatives wrapped tightly in cloth, unwilling to leave them in the archive vaults. Under the dim glow of her oil lamp, she stared through each plate again. The boy's faint outline seemed to change with every angle, as though he were turning toward her, slowly recognizing the gaze that sought him. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. The faint hum of the river below London Bridge echoed like breath against glass. In the final entry of her notebook that night, Eleanor wrote, "The child persists not in spirit, but in silver." Bellamy's obsession became the vessel. Each photograph reopens his loss, and every time grief gathers he returns. When she turned the lamp down, the room dimmed into half-darkness. But for a brief, impossible instant, she swore the outline of a boy stood reflected in the mirror behind her. His form soft, dissolving yet watchful, and somewhere in that silence, she understood he had never left. He had only been waiting for the light. By the early 21st century, the surviving Bellamy plates had been carefully restored and sealed within temperature-controlled glass at the National Gallery of Historical Photography in London. They sat in a dimly lit wing reserved for early Victorian experiments, the kind of collection that blurs the line between science and séance. Visitors rarely lingered long before them. Each plate was fogged with age, yet within that fog, faint shapes seemed to emerge only as one turned away. The child's outline, still centered in the frame, still impossibly calm, remained the most disquieting of all. Experts were divided. The chemists called it photochemical imprinting, a primitive accident of silver halide decay where one exposure ghosts into the next. A chemical echo, they said, nothing more. But the spiritualists, fewer now but no less certain, argued something else, that Bellamy's glass had caught more than reflected light, that the boy's image was not residue, but presence, a trace of the human spirit etched into emulsion by grief too heavy to fade. Eleanor Hargreaves lived to see the plates displayed for the first time in 1999. Frail and nearly blind, she sat before the exhibit as a guest of honor, her trembling hands folded in her lap. When asked by a journalist what she thought after all these years, she answered softly, "I don't think he was haunting us. I think he was reminding us that memory itself doesn't die. It only changes form. To some, it was the confession of an old woman still lost in obsession. To others, it was the closest thing to truth anyone had ever spoken about the Bellamy collection. In the years that followed, ethical debate consumed the art world. Should the plates remain on display, or should they be buried again with the dead they had once mirrored? Was it art or desecration? Museums drafted long statements about preservation and privacy, while others demanded the collection's removal, calling it an open wound kept behind glass. Yet through every controversy, the boy remained, always in the center, always watching. When Hargreaves passed away in 2001, the curators received an envelope sealed in her hand. Inside was a single sentence written in her familiar, slanted script. If you look long enough, he begins to breathe. Her ashes were scattered quietly near the same Yorkshire village where Bellamy had taken the first photograph more than a century earlier. The field was empty now, the cottage long collapsed, the earth grown over with wild grass. Only the wind moved, carrying faint whispers across the soil where light had once been fixed forever. And in that stillness, the story seemed at last to settle, not concluded but gently fading, like a final exposure reaching its end. No one took a picture of her funeral, but somewhere maybe he was there again. Photography was born from humanity's refusal to let go, a fragile attempt to trap light before it disappeared. In its earliest form, it was an act of love, a way to preserve the living. Yet somewhere along the way, that light turned inward, illuminating death instead. The boy in the photographs, unchanged across decades, stands as a silent contradiction. He is both there and not, both evidence and illusion. His face, pale and eternal, asks what no science can answer. Does remembrance itself possess a kind of life? Each photograph we take is a promise that we will not forget. But what happens when the image remembers us back? When the lens becomes the watcher, and the past refuses to remain still? Perhaps that is the real legacy of Bellamy's work, and of the boy who never grew older. Not a haunting, but a mirror, reflecting our own desperate need to make time stop even for a breath. And so the question lingers, soft and unsettling.